and welcome to another Now That's Weird with me, Ross Hemsworth. Now, what are, or who are, the Bilderbergers? The New World Order, an Orwellian state? Was 9/11 an inside job, or was it Al-Qaeda? 7/7 bombings in London, again, an inside job, or terrorists? What do you think? You may want to discuss this one in the forums at edgemediatv.com/forum, but tonight we're going to discuss it here on the show. My guest is Tony Gosling, who runs bilderberg.org.
That's right. I also edit one of the main 9/11 forums where people are discussing the war on terror.
And a full-time journalist as well on top?
Yep, freelancer. But the reason I came into getting interested in the Bilderbergs, I think, is because I was really amazed when I first came across them. If you actually put the list of these guys together, I mean, we're talking about the royalty of Europe, some of the most powerful bankers in the world, plus some of the media bosses, and the oil barons and politicians, you will find these people actually control most of the money in the Western world. This is incredible that, you know, I, as a journalist who'd been working on national and international stories, had never heard of them. When I talked to other journalists, either they hadn't heard of them, or else they looked at me as if, hang on, we're not supposed to mention that.
Now, a lot of people think this is just a conspiracy. I know you, as a researcher, have gone into this in some depth, and there's a lot more to it, possibly even control of our governments by these people. Well,
certainly, I mean, Will Hutton, who was the editor of The Observer, and he now still writes for The Observer, said in his column, after he'd been to a Bilderberg meeting, that the policy which they set at these meetings forms the backdrop against which policy is made right across the Western world. And, of course, it rolls out into other parts of the world because, really, financially, the West is the most powerful.
Well, some 15 years ago or so, David Icke started talking about this New World Order. Nobody took it particularly seriously at the time, and I think they're starting to now. Explain why and how the Bilderbergs are behind this New World Order.
Well, I don't know that they necessarily are 100% behind it, but certainly some of their aims and objectives seem to be the same. Now, the New World Order goes back to well before David Icke. Certainly in the Second World War, there was Adolf Hitler talked about a new world order, and the British writer Dennis Wheatley, many people will come across in his writings about the paranormal, the supernatural, and the intelligence services, because he himself worked for British intelligence in the Second World War. He was writing about this as well back in 1941. What they were saying then was that this would be a kind of totalitarian system whereby everything would be controlled. In other words, that there wasn't any idea of kind of free, independent thought, that people would be induced to take certain directions really without kind of independent free thought. And that was seen to be what the British and the other Allied powers in the Second World War was resisting.
Now, we seem to be seeing these 5 unions taking place. We already know we've got an African union. Apparently a document's recently been signed by George Bush, which brings together Canada, America and Mexico into a North American union. We've seen what's happened here with this treaty being signed in Portugal, something that we were supposed to all get a vote on at one point. Is it actually working now towards these 5 unions becoming this New World Order, do you think?
Well, I think we have to be a little bit careful with some of this stuff because I mean, I come from a professional journalistic background. What I try and do is to pin down this stuff to historical fact. There's lots and lots of speculation out there about what these people are up to, and I think probably it's fair to say disinformation too. So what I would recommend is that people go back to an excellent paper which was written on the Bilderbergs by a professor at Leeds Metropolitan University called Mike Peters, and he wrote this excellent paper, which I think is one of the best things ever written on it, which shows how actually the Bilderberg was devised by the Council on Foreign Relations War and Peace study groups in the Second World War before the war had finished. You see, this is the whole point, really, is that there were people who were thinking about the end game to World War II whilst the war was still going on, and Bilderberg was part of this. As you know, in 1944, the Allied powers met at Yalta, that is to say Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin all met, and they basically carved up Europe. Now, the Bilderberg was a political influence tool to use in Western Europe, basically the NATO countries.
Now, I've heard lots of stories about some of the things that go on. One in particular I'd like to put to you now is reference the American elections, which are coming up soon. Now, we're being told that Hillary Clinton was the first lady doorkeeper of the Bilderbergs, the first person to meet and greet guests. And certainly the information that's come back to me prior to this show is that, normally speaking, that is the next American president. Now, when you question people associated allegedly with the Bilderbergs, they are absolutely 100% convinced Clinton's getting into the White House. Now, we've seen the thing change, and she's now now out of the race, Obama's going forward. Could it be they're wrong, or is there going to yet be another development in this race, do you think?
I don't think necessarily there will be, but one thing's for sure, when you read the official lists which are released by the Bilderbergers to the press, and those lists incidentally have on them written confidential. Now, I don't know, I've never seen a press release which is confidential. I mean, the idea, of course, is that this information should be released to the public, but they still write that on there. That essentially, there are people that go to these meetings that aren't on the list. So, in a way, it's like a double con, really, and for the newspapers to mention, well, this person and this person may have been there. And what they do, I think, is they remove certain people. I mean, for example, I spoke, the last meeting that took place in the UK was at Turnberry in Scotland, the West Coast in Ayrshire, back in 1998. Now, I spoke to the woman who served Tony Blair his breakfast, and yet he wasn't on the list. So I think what's happening is, with these meetings, is that people are there that aren't officially we're not being told are actually there. So, of course, people like Hillary Clinton and others who we're not being told about may well be greeting people. But it was really interesting this year because it was exactly, if people want to go, don't believe me, go and check it for yourselves. When Hillary Clinton announced that she wouldn't be standing against Obama was almost exactly timed to coincide with this year's Bilderberg meeting.
It's very strange. Now, I saw a documentary recently that had Dennis Healey stating outright that he was not a member of the Bilderbergs, nor is Gordon Brown. What's your views on this? Do you think he was involved in it? And is Gordon Brown in it?
Healey definitely was. I mean, he's on the record on John Ronson's series as saying that he was. So I don't think there's any doubt about Dennis Healey. Although he didn't like John Ronson asking him if he had any personal photographs taken inside the meetings, because of course that's one of the things they really discourage. But as for Gordon Brown, he has attended the meeting, but I think you've hit on an interesting point there, because not everybody who attends the meeting, Will Hutton's one of them, I think goes along with their plans. I mean, Will Hutton is not the sort of person, I think, who is 100% behind the current sort of globalisation agenda. And a lot of the stuff that he writes in the paper is critical of it. So one of the things they do at these meetings is they invite people who are sort of on the fringes, powerful people, whatever, influential people, in order to try and get them on board the programme. And I think Brown is quite possibly one of them.
Now, the names that keep getting thrown at me as being part of this Bilderberg organisation are all Western. They're either Americans or they're British or Europeans. Are there any others from the Eastern Bloc or from the other side of the world that are involved in it that you know of?
Well, you see, the Bilderbergs will tell you that they actually have people from Russia too. But if you look closely, you'll see that they are actually from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is a US office in Moscow. So, you know, they don't really include any countries outside the NATO zone. This is why I always bring it back to the Yalta Conference, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin dividing up the world, and it's this part of the world where people are allowed to go to Bilderberg meetings. You get very, very few, none really, from any other parts of the world. There's a sister organisation which was also set up by the Rockefellers, called the Trilateral Commission, which extends right out to the Far East. But Bilderberg really is only Europe and North America, and the most powerful countries, most influential countries in those two continents.
One of the speakers at a recent conference I went to put forward a very, very strong argument to suggest that the axis of evil that they talk about, Iran, Iraq and I think it's North Korea, have got one thing in common. None of those three countries owe any money to the World Bank. Now, what do you make of that? Is that some sort of stranglehold there because they're not involved in the clench, if you like? Quite
possibly. The World Bank, I mean, if you look at the old, the Bretton Woods structure of the global financial system, that is to say the World Bank, the IMF, the Bank of International Settlements, these are the people that really pull the strings in the global money system. I mean, if you're, say, a little African country and you're having problems, obviously as Zimbabwe is right now, having problems with your financial system, you go to speak to the Bank of International Settlements and they'll give you a short-term loan and you're slowly drawn into this massive financial process. The IMF then puts conditionality on those loans, so you have to, for example, privatise your health services, privatise your transport systems and your utilities in your country in order to keep getting these loans. So it is like a kind of stranglehold on those countries, and it's certainly, I think it's replaced really what was old-fashioned colonialism. You know, you've got the old Spanish colonies, obviously the British Empire, the biggest empire the world's ever seen. Now the control, it seems to me, is through financed through the IMF, the World Bank, and these all figure very heavily at the Bilderberg conferences. In fact, probably fair to say that they call the tune when they're talking about what the economic agenda is for the world, what they're talking about at these conferences.
It seems to me, wherever you look, if there's a country that doesn't quite do what America wants it to do, whether it be Iraq, whether it be Afghanistan, the tanks go rolling in. Or in this case, the planes and the bombs. Now, is it a case, do you think, that this Bilderberg operation or this New World Order are actually one by one making sure that every country around the world is on side with America?
Well, there's a certain amount of, shall we say, inducement for them to come on board, yeah. But I don't think that control is quite the right word to use. The other thing is, although the Bilderberg originated in the US, I don't think that the ideas that brought it about are just American ideas. I mean, I mentioned the Council on Foreign Relations, which is basically a private club that runs American foreign policy. There was also another organisation in the UK and others in Europe, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, Chatham House in London, that was also very instrumental in the sorts of ideas that Bilderberg is promulgating. So, you know, I don't think it's fair to just talk about America. I think if you look at the far right, the right-wing Israeli government, you look at the British government, which is a supposed left-wing government at the moment, and yet actually is acting like a right-wing government, then I think it's not fair really just to point the finger at the US. I think we have to look at the US, the UK and Israel as working together as part of this. And I think maybe the US troops being used more than others and the US military muscle being used, but not necessarily totally in control of the situation. I think many Americans feel that they're sort of paralysed by their democratic process being taken over by the neocons, who are, let's face it, pretty much gangsters. I mean, these are the people that were running the Iran-Contra scandal, and I don't know if you remember, but right at the end of his presidency, Bush Senior pardoned the people who were involved in Iran-Contra, right? This is where drugs were being sold in the US, and the proceeds being used to fund the Contra rebels, the right-wing guerrillas in terrorists, shall we say, in Nicaragua. Now, those people were pardoned, and now many of them are very, very influential in the US government, which I think is one of the reasons why we're seeing what we're seeing in the world today.
Now, we're both media people, we work within media, and Edge Media Television have certainly given us the ability to come forward with stuff that other channels won't carry. And you know yourself as a journalist, there are certain stories that the main media will not carry. And we have this general sort of consensus of opinion, if you like, that anything to do with the Bilderbergs, the New World Order, is something that's not going to make the front pages of our main tabloids. And yet we see from day to day more and more evidence that there is something going on. What's your view of that and the way the media treat it?
Well, I think there's an immense nervousness about it in the media, particularly because of the implications of the resurgence of Nazism and fascism that's implied by this New World Order. Obviously, it was something that Hitler mentioned. So I think it's two things, really. It's nervousness and the worry that people are going to lose their jobs. Now, let me tell you, I mean, most journalists in this country at the moment are in fear of their jobs in one way or another because there's massive cutbacks going on right across the board in newspapers, radio, television, journalism. Particularly local and regional newspapers are sacking staff. So the last thing they want to do is rock the boat. And let's not forget, it's not the journalists. The journalists don't own the printing presses and they don't own the transmitters. So they're having to tread a little bit carefully. So there's that nervousness. But then I think it's also fair to say that there are techniques which are used to censor these stories. Say, for example, in a big event like 9/11 or 7/7, what happens is if a journalist is onto a story which doesn't fit the official story, which doesn't fit that pattern, then what happens is the editor will get a call from whoever, security services, police, or somebody else, to say, we believe that you're about to run this story, and basically issuing denials before the story has ever hit the printing presses.
Well, we're going to talk in depth about 9/11 in part 2, but I just want to touch on 9/11 because I think it comes into this whole question about the media and the way it's reported. Because there's a very famous piece of footage that shows a BBC reporter reporting Building 7 coming down whilst the building is still obviously intact behind her. The building comes down while she's talking and they mysteriously lose their connection with their journalist in New York. What do you make of that?
Well, I think the most interesting thing is Jane Stanley you're talking about on BBC World, and it was extremely strange that now just literally, I think it was within the last month or so, the BBC did issue a statement to do with that, to explain it, because it was in the journalistic press. It was covered within, you know, sort of the Press Gazette and other newspapers or sort of little periodicals that journalists get. It was covered in there. And many questions were asked about why. How did she, was she some sort of clairvoyant? What was going on here?
How did she
and
know,
what they said was actually that this was a statement was actually issued by Reuters on the day, early. And then they said, the BBC said, that Reuters got it from a local news story, right? But they refused to name where and when that local news story was. So it's still a mystery.
It's still a mystery. Well, it remains a mystery. We're going to come back in part 2 and talk some more about 9/11 and the New World Order. Join myself and Tony Gosling in just a few minutes. Welcome back to Now That's Weird with me, Ross Hemsworth, and my guest, Tony Gosling. Now, I want to talk about 9/11 in this part because I suppose it's one of the biggest conspiracy theories that ever has started on any forum anywhere in the world. Did Al-Qaeda actually bomb with 2 planes 9/11? Did they crash them into the building? Or was this totally faked? Was it actually blown up by the American government? Because that's what they're saying on the forums is actually happened.
Well, they're not just, it's not just people on the forums that are saying this. The former Prime Minister of Italy has also said this. Many people have come out and said it because the evidence is that it was probably the most heinous crime that's ever been committed. 3,000 people roughly died that day, and yet we're being told the conspiracy theory that Osama bin Laden managed to carry all this out, really shut down the entire US air defence system for an hour and a half from a cave in Afghanistan. I don't think so. And as far as I'm concerned, I mean, this is going to come out eventually, I think.
It's a very tall
slowly
tale,
but surely. Well, just after it happened, I thought, well, that's a little bit dodgy. But of course, it always takes a while for information to come out, for you to put together exactly what happened. It seems to me that essentially what happened that day was a kind of remake of this Operation Northwoods, the plan to invade Cuba back in the 1960s, which was shelved by President Kennedy. And it's really difficult to know exactly what happened that day or who exactly carried it out, but certainly there are some serious problems. The one I've already mentioned, which is the non-existent US air defences, as you've got 4 hijacked aircraft flying around.
Yeah, exactly.
The other thing is the transponders on those planes switching on and switching off, and possibly new planes arriving. A lack of wreckage at the Pentagon. There are several really serious problems with the official story on September the 11th. It seems to me that the US is simply in a very bad financial and economic situation and sees superpower status falling away, and has decided that they need some kind of resource war in order to boost their economy, to take over resources around the world. And of course, a kind of false flag attack, an attack which is blamed on bin Laden, but it's actually carried out from within the Western intelligence services, seems to serve that purpose of actually starting a war. And of course, if you remember when Bush announced the war on terror a few weeks after 9/11, he did it with all these journalists kept about quite a distance away, with all the other presidents in the background, for this dramatic shot where he was talking about the war on terror starting. You know, the place where they've got the presidents carved into the rock. It all does seem to me to be quite stage managed, almost like made for TV.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, you know, we were in a situation in Iraq and Afghanistan where innocent people, many hundreds of thousands of innocent people, are suffering as a result. Now, I don't think it's any coincidence that also in Afghanistan, that the supply of opium has gone through the roof.
Absolutely.
In fact, we were only hearing from the UN the other day that they're having to bring in scientists from other parts of the world into Afghanistan to help refine the opium into heroin, actually internally in Afghanistan, because there's so much being produced now.
It's amazing. Well, I think that there's so many things now on 9/11, and I'll try from memory to go through the ones that certainly sort of stunned me when I found them out. Number one, traces of thermite found within the wreckage of 9/11. Now, thermite is probably the only explosive that can burn through metal in the way that building came down. Number two, there was an earthquake survey done at the time, which showed that this was the actual graph of a controlled demolition. Number three, William Rodriguez, who was the caretaker who wrote the book Last Man Out, said the first explosion started in the cellar. We also heard a team of electricians, funnily enough, all dressed in black, came in 2 or 3 days before and were working in various parts of only the buildings that came down, because there was a power cut and it was a total blackout. We also know that the planes that hit appeared now to be drone planes. We've never seen anyone on television saying, I lost a load of relatives, they were on the plane. What happened to all these dead people from the plane? Because most of them we've never had families standing up or suing for compensation. What about the libel issue? You know, if we were saying on this programme, for instance, this was an American government inside job, why am I not being sued for it? Because most people that have stood up and said it have never had any challenge to that information. And the list goes on. More and more things. We spoke in part 1 about the BBC footage of Building 7 coming down whilst the reporter had already been reporting that 7 was down. There's just so many things that are inaccurate. You picked up on the idea that the defence aircraft didn't intercept the planes. Now, only a few days before, one plane had got about 2 miles off of its radar track and was intercepted by 2 American jets within, I think it was just under a minute.
Well, so these jets fly at supersonic speed. Basically, what they're there to do, and every time an aircraft either diverts even slightly off course, or else if there's any kind of problem with radio contact, as there was straight away with all of these 4 aircraft on that day, what happens is the fighter is scrambled, and the idea is that the pilot in the fighter gets eye contact with the cockpit of the airliner, and that didn't happen on September the 11th. And I think we have to ask questions about why on earth the American air defences, what were they doing? They were all up in Alaska, flying around somewhere else. But, you know, this is the most powerful superpower on earth. It has the biggest, most powerful air force on earth. And the problem, of course, was on September the 11th. If you look into it, you'll find that there were many exercises going on 9/11. And so what the people who were involved in the exercises were the air defence staff in there with their little radar screens, and so they were assuming that this was part of the exercise. In fact, there is recordings of people saying, "Is this an exercise or is this real?" Yeah, and I think it's quite feasible as well with the final aircraft, the one that came down in Shanksville. We were told that the actual passengers overwhelmed the hijackers and there was some sort of battle on board, and that they brought the plane down so that it didn't crash into somewhere in a city. But what's happened is the wreckage of that plane is strewn over a massive area. Yeah. So clearly the plane has actually been destroyed in the air. It didn't just kind of come down.
Tony, let's look at the Pentagon, because the plane that crashed into the Pentagon, bearing in mind these guys were supposed to be so well organised, crashed into an area where there were virtually no personnel. Now, in the other 4 parts of the Pentagon, some of the most important military personnel were stationed. Now, don't you think that smells a bit, to say the least?
Yeah, that particular bit of the Pentagon was being repaired, and so it was pretty much empty. The other thing is that we were told that, yes, there definitely was a plane at the Pentagon, except when the photographs were finally released a couple of years after 9/11, bearing in mind that there's CCTV cameras everywhere, why couldn't they just release a picture of this plane? When it was released officially to the world, actually there wasn't a plane in the picture. Outrageous. But I mean, people say, well, if no plane went into the Pentagon, then what happened to the passengers? And this is where we come back to this Operation Northwoods from the 1960s, the plan to invade Cuba, which Kennedy put an end to just before he was assassinated. In Operation Northwoods, what they were going to do was shoot down a plane that was actually a drone and send up the plane that drone was going to replace, but actually it would just be military personnel in plain clothes. So the idea was really that no ordinary civilian would be able to book a seat on that plane, but military people would be on it. And then the drone would be taken out by a missile or whatever, and that would be blamed on the Cubans. So it does seem to me that that plan was sitting on the shelf for a while and was jazzed up a little bit for 9/11.
Absolutely. Well, there's a very famous document, I can't remember what it's called, but it was something like Plan for a New America. And this document clearly says in there, what we need to bring the American population back together is something like a new Pearl Harbor. Now, that document relates to pretty much what's going to happen at 9/11 and the World Trade Center. What do you make of that?
Well, I think, you know, there's certainly a lot of... Well, I think the book is called The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and Its Geostrategic Imperatives by Brzezinski, who, by the way, is one of the mentors of Obama. And he wrote this back in '99, saying that America needs, you know, a new Pearl Harbor. So I think there is a lot of imperatives, economic mostly, behind America's need to start a kind of a new war and wider wars, not just Iraq and Afghanistan and other places, wider wars. I think this is really particularly worrying, particularly concerning. But I think slowly but surely the world is waking up to this.
I think it is. That's the thing. Now let's move to here and 7/7, the bombings in London. Again, there's too many discrepancies here. The guys were supposed to be that did it were supposed to have travelled down on a train from Luton down to London. When they looked into it, that train was actually cancelled that day. They couldn't have been on that train. We have a bus where the whole top of the bus was blown to pieces and blown off, and yet there's a picture of all the people on the top walking down the stairs. Surely the people on the top of the bus would have been killed. And the most blatant thing of all for me was a poster on the side of the bus that says, "Terror, bold and brilliant." Now, was that a coincidence?
Well, it could actually have been just a pure coincidence, that could. I mean, I think what happens is when you see events like this is you build up a pattern. Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of coincidences is not the same as just one coincidence. And let's take a rain check on 7/7. We've had no trial of whoever supplied these 4 guys with the so-called bomb equipment in order to carry out the attacks. And we've heard this guy, Haroon Aswat, who is currently in Belmarsh prison. Actually, no, I think he's in Broadmoor now, but he's being held with the possibility of being extradited to the US. We were told straight away afterwards, but then the story seemed to disappear, was in touch with the 4 guys by phone, by mobile, and possibly meeting up with them in the weeks preceding this. Now, John Loftus, a US security expert, has said that he believes that Haroon Aswat was working for MI6. So why on earth hasn't Haroon Aswat been put on trial for his connections with these London bombers? I mean, I think what we need to do in these situations is look at the normal process and see how what happens, actually happens, deviates from that. For example, 4 guys, 4 suspicious deaths, not one inquest of any of those 4 people. The same in the way as the Diana situation. It took 10 years for there to be an inquest into Diana's death, and maybe it's going to take 10 years from 7/7 for these guys to have proper inquests. I mean, essentially what we've ended up with is a horrific situation, I think, certainly for the families of the victims and people who were on the tubes that day, which is trial by television. We've had an announcement by Sir Ian Blair, who, shall we say, has got less than 100% confidence of the London population in his policing abilities, announcing to us who did 7/7. He's just told us who did it, and we're supposed to then go away and say, oh, that's all sorted out then.
Exactly.
Whereas actually there are, I think, at least 4 serious problems with the official story. One of the problems, of course, is that there is nobody who will put their name to the government's official narrative. It's an anonymous document. Nobody actually dares sign their name to it, and no one, it seems, will defend it. Very few, anyway. Firstly, we had an exercise, a bit like 9/11, going on the same day as the 7/7 tube bombings, being conducted by an ex-policeman who was actually at one point in his previous career, Peter Power, suspended for corruption from Southampton Police. His exercise was going on at the same 3 tube stations as these bombs actually went off. That's what he said on the day, and I find that a bit of a coincidence. In fact, if you sit down, there's 275 different tube stations in London. To have for it to be a complete coincidence that his exercise is taking place on the same day at the same 3 tube stations works out something like 7.6 billion to 1 chance that he's telling the truth.
Exactly.
Right? So I think it's pretty clear that exercise, I mean, what I would do if I was a policeman is I would ask him exactly who was doing this exercise. What was it all about? Maybe there will be an explanation that will come out. If so, let's have that explanation.
Well, we had Annie Mashin on the show a few weeks ago, and Annie was a former MI5 agent, as you know, with David Shayler. Both of them left the service because of state-sponsored terrorism. That was her quote. She said there was a plot by the British government to kill, or from the MI5 and MI6 anyway, to kill Colonel Gaddafi. Now, she said that they didn't sign up for state-sponsored terrorism, and she feels that some of this may be linked to what these organisations are up to. And another point, just going back to 9/11, which I think the audience should know if they don't already, is that the day before 9/11, $39 trillion was announced as being lost by the US government. Now, is it not somewhat strange that they chose that day to announce it? Because that would have made the front page of every paper in the world. There would have been some real explaining to do. But they chose to announce that just 24 hours before 9/11.
Well, there's another thing. Actually, on 7/7 itself, the Associated Press, which is one of the, along with Reuters, is one of the biggest news wire services that goes out to all of the newspapers and TV stations around the world, reported a story which bizarrely didn't appear in any of the British newspapers, but did appear in other English language newspapers around the world, which was, the actual headline was, Netanyahu changes plans due to warning, or changed plans on 7/7 due to warning. Now, what it said was that the Associated Press in Jerusalem, their desk in Jerusalem, phoned up the Israeli embassy and said, well, you know, is everyone okay? Obviously, they heard about the bomb attacks, and the Israeli embassy spokesman said, oh, yes, Benjamin Netanyahu, who was the finance minister, Israeli finance minister, who was in London at the time, he is actually didn't leave his hotel because he received a warning from Scotland Yard 8 minutes before the bombs went off. Now, if Scotland Yard can tell the Israeli embassy, why can't they tell the rest of London? I would have thought that that one also, you know, if I was a policeman, I would be asking questions about where that warning came from.
Absolutely.
I think it's all...
I've got to just stop you there, Tony, because we need to go to a break. But we're going to talk some more about this, and also the death of Princess Diana, something that won't go away, no matter how many times it's put into the press, how many hearings there are. There's still reverberations around the world. Was Diana murdered? Join us in part 3. Back to Now That's Weird. My guest is Tony Gosling. Now, Tony, we were talking in part 2 about 7/7, and I know that we had to cut you short a little bit running into the break there. So what's your real feelings of this? I mean, what actually happened?
Well, I think it's really difficult to know without an inquiry, and this is the thing you cannot really emphasise enough, is there hasn't been a proper inquiry into that. In fact, both Blair and Brown have said no, there won't be an inquiry. So if someone does, I think it's so important as well, because of the way that inquiries are run, is that it really is seen to be independent, and that all of the evidence which is given by all of the witnesses is recorded and published finally, you know, because this didn't happen on 9/11. Anyway, I mean, one of the other real problems with 7/7 is that we have been shown CCTV pictures, as I'm sure you've seen, of these 4 alleged bombers on the tube that day. The only trouble is, it wasn't that day, it was 9 days previously. And they did a dummy run, they called it anyway, a dummy run, where these 4 chaps were actually down in London, and those CCTV pictures we've been shown, if you have a look at the time codes, you'll see it was 9 days before 7/7. Now, there has been some footage released in a trial in Kingston recently, which shows the actual smoke from the bombs and this kind of thing, but still there's nothing to actually pin them down. I want to know, you know, why haven't they released these to the public? If they've got evidence, then the public deserves to see it, as do the families of the victims and people who were on the tubes that day. I mean, that's, to me, is one of the biggest problems. And of course, I don't know how people realise, but actually the tube was privatised 10 months before the bomb attack happened. This was a very controversial thing, because Ken Livingstone, when he was in charge of London, actually did a kind of a poll with Londoners to see, do you want to privatise the tube? And everyone said no. But anyway, Gordon Brown, when he was Chancellor, insisted on privatising it and awarded a 30-year contract to an Israeli company to actually run all the security systems on the tube. That is to say, the CCTV pictures, etc. The only trouble is that company's parent company's boss is actually now on the run, having absconded with $13 million actually in Namibia. So you can Google him up. His name's Kobe Alexander. The American Securities and Exchange Commission, which oversees the New York Stock Exchange, is after him. So let's have a little look at this company that we have trusted with looking after 3 million Londoners a day. And I think, I mean, the first thing to do, it seems to me, is to bring that back into official government control where everything is open. Because, of course, one of the first things that happens when these sorts of things are privatised is secrecy. Everything's commercial confidentiality.
Absolutely. Now, if terrorists didn't pull off the 7/7 attacks, who do you think did?
I don't know. I don't honestly think it's a good idea to get too much into speculation about that, because we just simply don't have the evidence. The thing that I will emphasise about 7/7 is I worked for the BBC in London back in the early 90s on stories to do with IRA bomb attacks. There was attacks at the Stock Exchange and other places in London the IRA were doing. Now, when this thing happened, I thought, as soon as I started looking into it, there were all sorts of things that didn't add up about it. So that's why I think we need a proper inquiry of some sort. Now, you know, doing documentaries and shows like this is one way of actually looking into this stuff. But at the end of the day, an official inquiry is the only way to go, because it's just not good enough to allow the Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police to go on TV and tell us, well, this is what happened, go away everyone, and let's move on. You know, it's just simply not on.
Do you think it'll ever happen,
Justice can't be done in those sort of situations. I think it has to happen.
Do you think it will, though?
Yes, I do.
You do? Well, let's move on to another thorny topic, Princess Di. Now, this is a subject that just won't go away. It keeps rolling on and on. We've had inquiries, we've had public inquiries, hearings, but it keeps rolling on. Now, I watched a video the other day by Chris Everard. It's called Lady Di, D-I-E. And it goes for 4 hours through all of the evidence and suggests that it probably wasn't an accident. Now, I don't know if you've actually seen the DVD. First off, have you watched it?
I haven't seen it. I know about it, but I haven't actually seen it yet, no. But, I mean, I do know a fair amount about the Di assassination. Certainly one of the most... yes, I definitely think it was. I mean, what we've heard is from an ex-MI6 guy called Richard Tomlinson. Now, he was very disenchanted with the British Foreign Intelligence Service, MI6, and wrote a book called The Big Breach about his experiences. What happened, basically, is he was supposed to be a James Bond-style agent out in the former Yugoslavia, where he was sent into a situation where somehow his bosses had leaked out the fact that he was supposed to be undercover. And this is a very dangerous situation for a spy to be in. If he thinks he's undercover and whoever he's supposed to be spying on realises that he's actually a spy, he could easily lose his life. And luckily he didn't. He managed to escape. But he's involved in the diner business because he has sworn an affidavit saying that whilst he was actually working for MI6, he saw plans to kill Slobodan Milosevic as a sort of covert operation, which was very, very similar to the way in which Diana died, in a tunnel with using some kind of flash to disorientate the driver and a car that was somehow fixed. And also, the other thing which really worries me about the diner business is the way the photographers were treated on the day. Now, immediately they were blamed. Now, there was a Channel 4 documentary that came out recently showing that actually the photographers were actually quite a distance well behind the car. So they weren't immediately, I mean, there wasn't even necessarily a reason to be travelling at super high speed because the photographers were actually some distance behind. And it took them several minutes to actually arrive on the scene. But what happened afterwards was really suspicious, the way that all the photographers were then rounded up, corralled in front of the world's press in a sort of Pantechnicon with see-through windows so that they could immediately be blamed for what happened. I remember hearing it that evening. I was listening through it and thinking, this is all a little bit surreal. I was awake early in the hours of the morning listening to it. And the announcement, I felt, was the fact that it was an accident immediately. There wasn't really, again, a proper investigation into what happened, and there still hasn't been, to my mind. I'd be interested to see what Chris Everard has dug out. But it certainly was the motive there was there, most definitely, because there was extreme rancour and bitterness in the royal family for Diana, and the way that she was able to literally go and talk to a journalist at the drop of a hat. I think the other thing was that the public were very big fans of Diana, as was shown by the funeral, you know, the massive turnout for the funeral and the flowers, whereas the British population is generally disenchanted with the royal family itself. So I think the royal family saw her as a threat. In fact, Diana herself said that before she died.
I think it's interesting, actually, on this. When I watched Chris's DVD, Chris puts forward some pretty damning evidence, I have to say, in this DVD. Number one, that the car that was used, that she was killed in, was stolen 2 months before. The only thing that was missing from the car, and it was stolen apparently by 3 guys in black masks, armed. So you'd think it was going to be used for a bank robbery or something. Apparently it wasn't. There was no extra mileage put on it. But what he puts forward in the DVD is that the engine management system, which you can buy apparently the block for about 120 quid, was the only thing stolen from the vehicle. And yet the vehicle was missing for a period of time. When it came back, they think it may have been weakened because this car, when it crashes, because of the type of build it is, wouldn't have sustained the damage, according to Chris, that this car actually sustained on the night of the accident. And he reckons during this time of the theft, there's a possibility it was weakened on the main stress points of the vehicle. He also points out that he did the journey from the tunnel to the hospital in 11 minutes in the rush hour, where the ambulance took, I think it was 1 hour 20, wasn't it, or 2 hours. And also the point that the ambulance allegedly stopped very, very close to the hospital, within a few hundred yards, because the doctor wanted to perform some sort of surgery on Diana in the ambulance. Now, when you're that close to the hospital, you have to ask why. And the DVD goes on to make some very, very big claims on what went on in that tunnel that night. And of course, the Fiat, which many people say was blamed for the accident, has never been recovered, and the driver never identified. We're going to come back and talk some more with Tony in a moment, but I'm going to break here to go across to the forums, find out what's been going on with Penny.
All right, the first thing tying in with what we're talking about today is Project Bluebeam. Now, apparently this project involves two main things. The first one is like a Montauk type experiment where they can whisk off a bunch of people, as in disappear in front of other people's houses, and whisk them off seemingly just gone. Secondly will be the projection with laser type technology via satellite of images of Christ. Apparently this has already been done in the deserts. And also, if they can project religious images, they can also project aliens, anything they pretty much well like. But the aim of all of this is almost to create that situation so people are in awe, thinking it's like a second coming. And because they're manufacturing it, they can pretty much dictate what the people are going to feel. The second thing that I found, which was quite interesting, was actual quote. I actually watched a video of Barack Obama and his speech in Berlin. Now, it was a Sky News clip that I watched. The actual presenter said herself that Barack Obama, in his speech regarding the New World Order. Now, I will not normally read, but I'm going to read this passage because I want to get the quote exactly right. His quote is, "In this new century, Americans and Europeans alike will be required to do more, not less. Perhaps, and cooperation is not a chop." Sorry. Gonna have to cut it. "Partnerships and cooperation among nations is not a choice. It is the only way. A one way to protect our common security and advance our common humanity." I thought that was really interesting.
It's powerful stuff,
Very
isn't it?
powerful.
And Tony, what do you make of that? I mean, Barack Obama, if he gets in as the next president of the United States, are we looking at a change, or are we looking at the same thing again?
Well, I think that the forces behind the scene in the US now are so powerful. I mean, we're talking about the sort of gangster mentality, really, that it almost doesn't matter anymore who's the front man. It's the machinery going on behind the scenes. I mean, what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. They're really the driving force behind the US government. You know, they seem to have kind of got their fingers in just about every pie in the US. So, no, I think Obama's going to have a real hard time if he wants to be a libertarian along the lines of someone like Jesse Jackson would have been if he was president.
Well, I think time will tell, and I don't want to drag too much onto the American elections because we have already discussed that, but there's a lot of people saying that they don't think Obama will ever actually make it to office because there's still a big feeling about the whole racist issue in America. The Ku Klux Klan apparently are still very active in America. Is there a chance that, you know, he may not even make that trip? I mean, it just seems...
Well, I think, you know, I don't want to get too much into that sort of speculation. I think it's possible, but I think, you know, it's also quite possible that something like that won't happen and that he'll just be, you know, an obedient puppet president in a way, I suppose, more like George Bush was. I think when people talk about Bush being orchestrating things like 9/11, in fact, there's bumper stickers in the US that say Bush knew. He's not. He doesn't know anything about it. He's bounced on the day, on 9/11, into being told this is what's happening. And he just goes along with it. And I think Obama is actually going to be, if he's not bumped off, as you seem to be suggesting, and someone else put in his place, his presidential, his vice president, he's just going to have to simply do what he's told.
Well, it's certainly not me suggesting that, but a lot of people are talking about that in forums and around, certainly in America. When I was in America earlier this year, it was actually told to me by one of the people at the conference I attended that this was what the Americans were discussing, whether this might happen.
Well, there have been discussions in this country, as you probably know, about Robin Cook and the way that he died.
Yeah,
you know, because he really would have been, as soon as Tony Blair left office, he would have been a shoe-in in the Labour Party. He would have been the man almost definitely to take over from Blair. And yet, 2 years previous to that, he had this accident on a mountain. Again, an exercise was involved. And I think, you know, it's all very well talking about the US, but I think we need to also look at politics in this country and the way that New Labour has been really created as a kind of right-wing party, not the traditional party of the trade unions by any means, and of course the trade unions are pulling the funding from it.
Absolutely. Well, let's look at the whole Orwellian state idea, because I know this is something else that you've researched and looked into.
Yeah.
Now, everyone's probably familiar with the George Orwell book 1984, the Big Brother state, if you like. And it was suggested to me the other day that we're seeing so much murder and crime on the front page of the newspapers at the moment because we're being prepared for a police state here, and that we will actually welcome it because we're seeing kids knifed on the streets week after week. Now, if you actually look at the figures, there's probably been half a dozen murders, and when you think of the size of our population, has it actually been blown out of all proportion?
Well, we obviously see on the news the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, but let's also remember there's a battle for hearts and minds going on here, right here in Britain. I mean, for example, the idea of imposing the national ID database. Is this an idea which is going to be successful? I'm really not entirely sure about that. There's a lot of people pushing for a national ID database, but let's not forget, in fact, it's really important we don't forget that this is exactly what the Nazis were doing in the run-up to the Second World War and during the Second World War. In every country they occupied, they wanted everybody filed into a national ID database. They didn't actually call it a national ID database, but that's what it was. In fact, an American Jewish writer, Edwin Black, I don't know if I can show you this now, has written this award-winning book all about this, and it shows you that there are some really powerful connections between big American corporations, and they were actually... the interesting thing is, when the Nazis were... cataloguing people, basically. This is what they did. They put them on these little punch cards so that what they could do was simply say, well, the Gestapo needs to know the names and addresses of all the Jews in, say, for example, Warsaw. They press the button, and this machine would whir away, and after 20 minutes or so, there'd be a stack of cards with all the Jews in Warsaw and their names and addresses, and they would then go out and arrest them. Now, the weird thing was that this was not a German machine, this was a US machine. They were actually hired by the IBM Corporation to the Nazis to do that job. The thing that worries me, and why it's so relevant today, is that IBM is very active in the National ID database system. For example, they've just, in the southwest of England, amidst cries of corruption from the Bridgewater MP, which was uttered under parliamentary privilege in the House of Commons, they have actually... IBM have now in control of all the police civilian support services around Somerset and the west of England, and Avon and Somerset Police. This is my own police force. You know, so it's not as if this is just something in the past. I think we need to be really concerned about some of the connections between these draconian measures that are happening today and remember what happened back in the 1930s. Let's not forget.
Well, let's go to the audience. Have we got anyone in the audience with a question for Tony on this issue? We've got one here. Now, Penny, I believe you've got the microphone there. So.
In your opinion, what are the most noticeable changes to our society going to be in the next few years as a result of the New World Order?
Well, I think it's going to be a battle. I don't think it's just going to be imposed, and I don't think it can be imposed. Just as, you know, as I say, there's physical fighting going on in some parts of the world, I think there's really an ideological battle going on. And although most ordinary people don't necessarily see this, this is certainly taking place in the big institutions and the powerful institutions in Britain. It's a battle that's taking place, for example, in the BBC. It's taking place within the armed forces, and it's taking place within the police force. And I think you will find, actually, that the ordinary British police are quite concerned about the whole Big Brother state business. They don't see themselves as fascist Gestapo characters. They've got wives, many of them have got children as well. So I think what we're seeing in a way is a kind of echoing of the physical fighting that's going on in other parts of the world, the Middle East particularly, here in the UK. So I don't think it's all over yet. by any means.
Well, on that very point, we're coming up towards the end of the show, so fairly quickly, could you tell us, is it all doom and gloom?
Well, no, I don't think it is, because I think actually, because a lot of these ideas are actually out there, and a lot of the Western institutions are aware of the New World Order, and whilst general public may scoff and laugh at it, I think there are many people that are aware of it. I actually think that these the powerful people in the world, the military-industrial complex, is now beginning to be on the back foot. And ultimately, as far as I can see, there's no way they can actually win if they can't get people's hearts and minds. And I'm afraid it seems to me they're slowly but surely now are losing that battle.
Tony, thanks for joining us. It's been a delight talking to you today. Whatever your thoughts on this, let's discuss it in the forums, edgemediatv.com/forum. Let us know what you think. I'd be interested to read your comments. You can email me as well directly into the show, ross@nowthat'sweird.co.uk. If you'd like to be in our audience here for perhaps one of the future shows, drop us a line at the same address, ross@nowthat'sweird.co.uk. We'll see you next week.